everybody!
Turn this up in our headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. And Dylan, can we just acknowledge the best-selling author in the room, please?
Yeah, it's not just any best-selling author today, Charles. We have with us today a New York Times best-selling author, Locus Award winner, and lord of all that is grim and all that is dark, the author of the first Law World books in Shattered Sea Trilogy, with the third and final book in the Age of Madness, The Wisdom of Crowds, releasing tomorrow, September 14th. Welcome to Friends Talking Fantasy, Joe Abercrombie.
Woo. Yeah. I'm actually getting quite excited myself with an introduction like that. I was like, there's someone important and exciting going to appear on the show. I didn't know.
It's you.
Joe, it's you. No, we have been like super excited to have you on for a long time. We've been reading through all the books in the world of the First Law for how long has it taken us, Dylan? 6 to 9 months to read and talk about them on the show. And we've done character studies and all that. So it's
almost as long as it took me to write them.
That's very impressive. Yeah. I mean, we spent a lot of hours recording, so we put a equal time, I'd say, into the world of the First
Law.
Effort
in many ways.
Exactly. I would agree. So now today, on the eve of the release of Wisdom of Crowds, I mean, this is just a climactic ending to our read through of the series. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, hey, it's a pleasure. And thanks for, the attention you've been giving the books. I mean, it's always great when anyone reads them. This is nonsense that I dreamed up in the middle of the night for my own amusement, not realizing anyone would ever find it interesting. So that there are people who are willing to put hours of their lives into thinking about it and analyzing it and chewing over it is a huge compliment. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Dylan, I can picture Joe Abercrombie at night thinking about all these bloody murders and dismay and just a smile on his face as he gently drifts off into sleep.
Yeah, it's somewhat alarming, but we have had an incredible time reading all these late night murder thoughts that you've been having, Joe. So it's unbelievable to have you here. So grateful. And I guess we'll just get started with these questions.
Yeah, sure. Let's go. Fire in. What do you want to know? What can I tell you?
Okay.
We'll put you to the test. That's our goal.
So, Joe, I've been reading your books for a long time now. I've been following the stuff you've been putting out. The Blade itself was originally published in 2006, and your 9 books and 1 short story collection into this world. And we feel like we've seen so much growth and evolution from you as an author. Where would you say you have grown or improved most?
Well, it's important to underline that I'm still very much a fresh new voice in the genre. I think
of course.
From that introduction, there's an implication that I might be getting long in the tooth, getting on in age. I've been around a bit, part of the furniture, whereas nothing could be further from the truth. Still very much fresh on the scene, young, dynamic, punk maverick.
Yes.
Still turning this genre upside down after all these years. I think it's important to establish that as a baseline.
Absolutely.
But I suppose there have been a few changes, not just in the amount of hair on top of my head, but also in the writing style.
More now.
Approach to writing generally. I mean, I think I've learned to get a better result much more quickly and to be a lot more efficient in the way that I kind of revise and go over things, certainly that. But really, it's the same approach as it was at the start in broad terms. The idea was always to kind of do fantasy with the gloves off, do fantasy that was to some degree shocking and surprising, a kind of approach to fantasy like Unforgiven is to the Western, a sort of revisionist style that's a bit grittier, and nastier, that focuses on the seedy side of life and the sort of grayer areas rather than the heroic and the villainous, if you like, rather than keeping things black and white. And it was to get very much in the heads of the characters, you know, get the reader, rather than seeing the world in big wide shots of spectacular mountain ranges and glorious cities on the hill with these tiny little figures a bit indistinct. I wanted to do big sweaty close-ups like a spaghetti western, you know. I wanted the reader to feel pressed right up against these unpleasant, weird, strange smelling characters. And in that sense, you know, the approach is very much the same. You know, I guess I've tried to take on more things as I've gone. I've tried to, you know, get a lot more female characters in there. Think a little bit more about the range of people that I'm covering, but fundamentally, I don't think it's radically different. You know, and obviously these books are all set in the same world and are kind of a piece, and so it makes sense that they should feel consistent and basically have the same approach.
Yeah. We feel you've stayed very true to your dark, twisted soul as you've moved through all this. And the characters, for sure, Joe, it feels like that voice and the way that you get into their heads and their perspectives, it absolutely blows our minds. And especially some of those chapters that you'll write, like casualties and the little people, where you'll rapidly switch point of view. That's one of the things that we've been most impressed by, that way that you so quickly ground us in a character, in their voice, and then
move on to the next
around and move. Yeah, it's like so we're curious about your use of point of view and what inspired you to be able to flip around like that in those chapters.
Yeah, I suppose I always wanted to do this thing where you were sort of very much in the head of the character, and where I wanted the writing to feel like it really mirrored the voice of the character and told you something about the person all the time. So that, you know, the ideal for me is that you can read a few lines of a chapter and know straight away whose head you're in, because hopefully the writing feels distinctive and like you're really in an intimate conversation with that person. So I suppose that's always been the cornerstone. I mean, that particular trick of sort of passing through a whole sequence of extras, that kind of rose out of the heroes particularly, which obviously was this big picture war story. It was intended to show the sort of scale and chaos of a battle from both sides. And it just seemed to suit that particular story. It seemed to be a good way to kind of get across the scale of events while still keeping track of the individual caught up in the events, if you like, and a good way to get out of the heads of the main cast and get a big cross section through all the sorts of people that are in there. Because, you know, there are often a lot of characters you might be interested in showing who aren't necessarily the big people, aren't necessarily the players, movers and shakers, the people you've picked as being particularly fascinating. They're not people who'd sustain a 3-book story. Maybe some of them are. I don't know. Maybe I'm being unfair. But they're kind of, you know, it's a good way to get from Marshall right at the top of the pecking order to Grunt right at the bottom, and everyone in between, and to really give you a sense of that cross section through society. And that just seemed to fit very nicely in the Age of Madness as well, where it's sort of a bit of a social study of the whole world and the world going through change. And so it felt like a great way to pick out some individuals and dip in at the heads of a whole section of different people, of immigrants, of workers, of owners, and the kind of the range of opinion and feeling that's going on.
I agree completely. And also, to me, you see kind of the consequences of some of the actions of the big people, because when you write POVs of your main characters, you're almost always very committed to their point of view and their biases and their ignorance. So you have someone who's like running all these factories, and then there's a rebellion, and you're like, how could this have happened, right? But then you go through the little people and you see someone who had no stake in where they ended up, and through circumstance, and just like, I just wanted to, like, I'm just thinking about going home to my family, and there's someone coming at me with an axe. I guess I'm dead now. And you're like, wow, because it's this element of life is cheap, and then also the consequence of the decisions made by these big people that they may have never considered, that we get to consider as an author. So in those cases, I was like, this is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm always conscious of, in fantasy, a lot of violent heroes who carve their way through scads of henchmen. You don't really think too much about the henchmen. There's that brilliant scene in Austin Powers. I don't know if you want the one I'm thinking of, where a henchman dies and then it goes to visit all the friends of the henchman who are having fond memories of him, and he was such a great henchman, And I think it's nice to dip into the heads of a lot of the small kind of individuals around, and that hopefully helps to humanize the cast altogether and see them as, people very much inserted into society. Everyone's part of a network, and hopefully it brings that to life a little.
Right. It definitely drives home the cost in a way that you can't just kill your main point of view characters all willy-nilly, and you gotta keep them around because you're telling their stories. And then you do this job where you can get us attached to a new character and all of their wants and their needs and their relationships. Sometimes they'll be thinking about their wife back home, and then all of a sudden they take a pike to the chest, and you're like, oh wow, this really kills people and hurts people.
Yeah, and you want the world to feel dangerous. I think one of the things that frustrated me a bit about some of the fantasy that I read as a kid, or eventually after reading a lot of stuff, I started to find it quite predictable, and to think there was no real danger in the world, and whenever anyone suffered, it was only a kind of temporary thing. People tend to walk away from everything without a huge amount of consequences and have a happy ending. And you want the world to feel dangerous. You want to be scared for the people, because if there's no sense that, it really is going to be genuinely dangerous, I think that takes away a huge amount, but when you really do feel the world's dangerous, it changes things immensely. I mean, Game of Thrones, it's a small little known book. You may not be aware of it. Written by a guy called George R. R. Martin. I think
Game of what? Game of what?
Never heard of it.
No, could be big one of these days. I think it'll have its moment. But reading the first of those books back in the day, as I did before I was writing myself, there's an important moment, without wanting to give away any spoilers of this little known book, but there's an important moment where a main character dies, and that seems shocking now, but at the time it was really mind blowing, because I'd never seen something like that in that kind of book. That doesn't happen in that kind of book. So
for sure,
it suddenly felt like the gloves were off and fantasy was dangerous and shocking again, and that's something I've always wanted to retain ever since, I guess.
That's true. Yeah. That was a shocking moment, and it's good that we're giving these smaller books some spotlight here.
Absolutely,
it's the least we could do.
I rearranged my shelves. I used to have my copy of Game of Thrones right to hand,
right in arm's reach.
I was going to whip it out, and
I could try to hand you mine, but I don't think that's how Zoom works. So
sadly not.
Yeah. Well, your Game of Thrones inspiration is very, very clear. It's actually how I got into your books was way back, and those kind of moments in Game of Thrones that were shocking and changed the way that we think about the fantasy genre. Then I was like, okay, where do we go from here? And your name was coming up a ton, and it really shines through your willingness to we think of it like you use the pieces on your chessboard really, really well. Like, which character belongs where, and when it's time for them to be taken off the chessboard. And we've always really appreciated the shocking character moments in your books.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be willing to go there. I mean, I suppose it's difficult to kill off your central cast, as you were saying. I think there's a tough balance to strike there. You want people to feel risk. You don't want them to feel it's safe. You want them to feel anyone can go at any moment. But at the same time, you want the story to be the story of something, and if you progressively kill off your central cast, eventually there's a question of what is it now the story of, because fundamentally, if characters are the heart of it, then it's the story of a set of characters, and so there are other things you can do with characters other than kill them, I suppose, which are still,
are you sure?
Shocking and unpleasant or dangerous in one way or another.
Yes. You'll take away sometimes the thing, and we aren't in the spoilers part yet, so we'll keep it vague, but you'll take away some of the things that the characters most treasure and leave them to just psychologically grapple with that. And to me, that's way more interesting than death, because death is so final. It doesn't have these psychological ramifications that you'll explore.
Yeah. I mean, I like to break them down and see what happens.
Yeah.
That's sort of the part of the fun. I think as particularly in the Age of Madness, like the first law had a lot of characters who were these outside loners. They were people who'd lost their families, lost their friends, decided to turn their back on what they knew, had struck out into the unknown. So, Logan had left everything he knew behind. Pharaoh has escaped the destruction of everything she knows. Glocta's obviously this kind of withered outsider everyone's turned their back on for one reason or another. And so it had a lot of these people who are kind of on their own and with nothing to lose in some cases, or with not a lot to lose, people who've suffered a lot in the past and they're kind of trying to pick up the pieces. Whereas Age of Madness has, in general, some younger characters who are much more part of their world, are quite successful within their world, perhaps who are at the top of society in some cases, who have families and friend groups around them, supporting them. And so it was nice to have these people with so much to lose, with so much on the line, with so much promise to destroy. And that was actually quite fun to be able to break those sort of people down, then rebuild them and see how they cope.
Yeah, and that was one of the most fascinating things to me after reading the First Law trilogy to reading the Age of Madness, is that you have characters that have families, and also they're in many cases descendants of previous POV characters as well. Yeah. So that kind of is what makes this trilogy stand out more so compared to the First Law. And we were curious about how you went about writing characters that are like, oh, Glocta's my dad. And so, did it involve a lot of deliberation, or did these characters come to you pretty naturally?
I suppose it was kind of a mixture of things. I mean, generally the approach with these books has always been, focus on the new cast, tell the new story. But if there is a slot there for a parent or a mentor or a senior member of government that is a pain in the arse, whoever it may be, why not fill it with someone who's already on the shelf, someone who's got some wear, and whose story we maybe know a little bit of. So one can imagine that in the Blade itself, there might have been a previous story in which Morovia and Salt and people were the young heroes of that story, and there were a different set of old codgers in the background. So it's natural that as you come forward, the young heroes become the old codgers in the next series. And I think as long as you make sure you don't kind of slip into fan service where it suddenly becomes the show of those older people, you've got to stick in the heads of your current cast and make it about them, the focus on them. But it's still nice to have those callbacks, and it's nice to have those characters on the shelf. When you need an old Lord Marshal, you can stick Brint in that role. And he's never been a big, major central character, but he's a character who's been through some stuff and who you know about a little bit. And so effortlessly, you've got a load of history there. That character's got a whole load of patina on them that you can make use of.
Right.
So in the case of, obviously a lot of the central cast in Age of Madness are the descendants or the proteges in one way or another of a lot of the central cast from the First Law. And so in that case, you've got some big figures, they're in the shadow of some really big figures. I mean, both in the terms of the book, they're the children of kings or the children of, really senior, powerful people, huge figures but also in terms of the reader, they know these people well, and they loom large in their minds, hopefully. So you've kind of got a lot to pay off, but I think you've also got a huge amount to draw on, there's a lot of responsibility, but there's a lot of material, and that's generally helpful. Right. So when you're looking at a character like Savine, she obviously has Glocta and RD as parents who are kind of big, vivid, powerful figures in one way or another. And it's kind of fun to imagine how they might have developed and how their relationship might have developed and what kind of upbringing a child might have had and what kind of child they would produce, what bits of the two of them come through and what bits that are unique, what bits that are unique to this period in which they're appearing, because it's a period of huge upheaval where one generation and the next are very different. So I suppose all those things were kind of on my mind, but it's still mostly a kind of trial and error. It's still mostly
Right.
when you sit down and start writing what happens, and I've kind of learned over time that however much planning you do and however much thought you put in before the fact, there's no substitute for sitting down and actually writing it. And so the plan with these books was always to write all three as a draft, because I kind of knew that I'd work out what I was writing as I wrote, and it wasn't until I finished the draft that I'd really know what needed to be done to the first book to make it work as well as I could. So that trial and error part of it was still, really important. And in the case of Savine, for as an example, initially I gave her an internal voice like Gloctor's. I thought, this would make sense.
Oh,
right.
Italicized internal voice, a cunning person who, is thinking clever, acid things. And it's the same as her father. So that kind of makes sense, but it didn't really work. I wrote the first third of that book in that way, but I was always, whereas with Gloctor, it was always fun to use that voice, and there were always things occurring to me to say in that voice. With Savine, I'd always be trying to think of things to say, and I'd be saying the same stuff, but in her internal voice. And the reason came to me pretty quickly. The joy of Savine is she says whatever she thinks. There's no dissonance. Gloctor doesn't say what he thinks. He always says the opposite. He says one thing and he thinks another, because he's always guarded, he's always plotting. Whereas the joy of Savine is, she'll just tell you to your face and laugh while she does it. That's her power. So it didn't really make any sense to have this internal voice. So I took it out. She worked much better, on her own terms, I guess.
Yeah, and it makes sense as a character who grew up with, Glocta grew up with a lot of privilege, but then got heavily grounded. And as a character who hasn't had that moment yet where she's gotten humbled, that why would she not just say exactly what she's thinking? It sounds like you trust your intuition with that. Yeah.
So much, as you say, so much power and privilege in so many ways, she really can lord it over people quite effectively.
And that's the other thing about, because there's like the next generation of cast, right? And you talked about how having the previous generation to pull on as, nice tools to have in your back pocket. It also brings in this theme that you have of how kind of history needs to be relearned by the next generation. You have so many wise characters that are parents that we loved as main characters in previous books. And then you see like Leo, like, oh, I'll be a legend like the Bloody Nine. And then I'm like, the Dogman's like, oh God, what are you doing? So
those were warnings.
So as many times as these parents have tried to teach these lessons, you get this added benefit when they're generational of like, you get to see them make the same mistakes. And, I get the sense that history is just actual history is a huge influence in creating this world as well. Like I've seen book tours of yours where you have tons of like nonfiction history books and things like that. So I can imagine this having to relearn history or being doomed to repeat it kind of theme being used when you bring in generational characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always kind of liked that circular shape, and the first law obviously has a very self-consciously circular shape for everyone involved in it. And I suppose fantasy often has a very linear shape, epic fantasy of the classic Tolkien mold, as a linear shape in which people grow and change, and they go from peasants to kings, or they go from, used up men of violence to healed guys who can contribute once more, and the world is often healed, and there are transformative wars where things come good in the end, and a new epoch is ushered in at the end of those things, often following a final battle. Whereas if you look at the battles of our world as final battles, there's not a lot different afterwards. Things often go back to how they were before. Seeds of the next conflict is implicit in the last. And so I kind of enjoy those circular motions and the feeling that this isn't some epochal moment of change. It's just one more moment in an ongoing history that kind of has no start and no end. It went on before the start and it will go on after. And it feels like an episode within a wider world, if you like.
Right. Yeah. There's that great Casca quote in This Would Be Best Served Cold, I believe, where he's like, and people might change and might do all these kind of things, but it's like, but given time, they change back, and
yeah.
it feels so true.
That is best of gold.
The message, the message that you sent throughout the first law, and in the Stanley, and we're progressing through the Age of Madness, if progress is even the right word for it.
Yeah, and I think some readers find that kind of frustrating. There are readers who find Koska frustrating, because he's this very charismatic, kind of glamorous character in some ways, but he's also unable to, he's unable to be positive. He's unable to make progress. He always reverts, and a lot of the characters revert. And I find that, a lot of people revert. It's that classic thing of, you think, oh, I put on some weight. I'll go on a diet. You go on a diet, you lose some weight. But I mean, you never lose the weight forever.
Yeah.
The weight comes back. It's not a battle you win. It's a battle that's fought daily, every day. And the same is true of everything. The same is true of being a better person, of changing yourself one way or another. So this kind of idea of wonderful transformations in people is sort of has always seemed to me a little bit of a dangerous myth in a way, because things just are never that easy for people.
Yeah, especially one of my favorite things about the first Law trilogy was watching Jazal unlearn his lessons. To me, that's such a quintessential thing, and it has me genuinely scared for some of these characters in the Age of Madness too. We'll see where the last book goes, but to me, that's it's part of human nature, and that's what some of these characters capture so well. And one of the things that I've always loved about the world of the first law is your willingness to commit sometimes to who these characters are. And fans love Glokta, fans love Logan, but then you commit to them being unlearning their lessons and sometimes doing unpopular things and writing moments where they turn their backs on loved ones or family or be extra violent and doing things that are not heroic. And it's what makes the world, like you said, circular and lived in. And it's part of that grimdark charm we've all come to appreciate.
Yeah, I hope so. I suppose that was, in a way, it was just what emerged naturally from writing the story and just what seemed like the right outcomes for people. And with the first law, certainly a lot of it was about consciously doing the opposite of what classic fantasy might do, So in some ways, it's kind of obvious, whatever works in fantasy would fail there. I've always been really interested in failure. I don't think failure gets covered enough. Things going wrong, and war generally is the story as much of failure, if not more, about failure and mistakes than it is about success. We're always offered these 1,000,000-to-1 shots that just happen to come off, rather than the each way bets that go wrong for people, which is generally what it's about. Funny enough, I watched The Bridge Too Far again the other day with my son. The film about Operation Market Garden, the big paratroop thing that went on at Arnhem in the Second World War. And that's everything in that is about failure. And it's just a constant story of little mistakes that are made that add up to bigger mistakes on both sides, and it's kind of just this fascinating thing of, the one who wins is often the one who makes the fewer or the less bad mistakes, rather than the one who makes that one glorious charge. It's not, the world's not really about that.
Right.
Yeah. And I'll say too, all of that willingness to have characters fail, have characters revert back, to me, it makes it even more rewarding when some characters do eke out that growth. And I do think we see that, especially in Red Country. I feel like I would say Shy and Temple, I perceive them as sincerely growing. Maybe not every character in that book displays growth, but when you see that happen, it's so earned that these characters fought tooth and nail for growth in your dark, cynical world.
Well, one cannot have light without shadow, I guess, and in the darkness, a tiny candle flame will shine so brightly.
Very, very well spoken. And it doesn't surprise me at all that Dylan reverts to talking about characters and psychology and things, because Joe, you and Dylan actually have something in common here. You're both students of psychology.
There
You
you go.
have a bachelor's in psychology, Joe, and then Dylan here is actually a PhD candidate in clinical psychology, right, Dylan? Is that correct?
Counseling.
Counseling psychology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Serious then. A lot further than me. Yeah.
Well, one of the things we wanted to know, because we have
books.
this interest. Yeah, you're busy, Joe. We'll forgive you.
Yeah.
But has any of your psychology training or background influenced your writing or your characterization at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Especially just in the sense that I think everything you do finds its way into your work in one way or another. You know, everything that you really enjoy or that you don't, everything you study, everything you read or play or watch, you know, it all kind of finds its way in there, and little bits of little details of things will, you know, creep through into your writing. You can't avoid it. You wouldn't want to avoid it. That's where it all comes from. So definitely some bits that I've studied in psychology. And I mean, in particular, one thing that I did, you know, focus on that I wrote my dissertation about was human error and failure. It was, you know, why systems fail, why ships sink, why nuclear reactors melt down. So it was about kind of the nature of failure and designing systems that fail. And, you know, a lot of the reading I've done in military history and so on is kind of, you know, looks at the battles and wars in a kind of similar lens of why things go wrong, and why things going wrong is entirely inevitable, you know, and how massive failures can be based on small misapprehensions. Like, you know, in the nuclear reactor, they make a set of sensible decisions based on the reading they've got, but it turns out the dial's stuck. You know, that kind of mistake.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by that. Or the Charge of the Light Brigade, where, you know, this bizarre and stupid thing was done really because of the set of personality conflicts in the chain of command. You know, a set of people who all hated and disrespected each other, and a set of kind of extremely unlikely situations that just happened at the same time to create this, you know, appalling disaster. And so I've always been fascinated by those things going wrong, you know, because in fantasy, as I say, things tend to go right for the heroes, or they'll develop these outlandish, unlikely plans that then, you know, it all just comes together at the key moment. I mean, Luke, it's 1,000,000 to 1 shot, but the torpedoes go in the tube, right, in the exhaust tube, and it works.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'd kind of be fascinated to know what happens if they just bounced off, you know? What's the next thing? What's the next step? So,
Luke would question the force, have an existential crisis, run off for a while, you know.
That kind of thing, maybe. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely taken a fair bit from psychology, you know. Whether it's really about the psychology of the characters, I don't know. I mean, you will know, obviously, psychology as a academic discipline is not much about personality of people. You know, it's about behavior, you know, and scientific analysis of patterns of behavior. There's a lot of statistics in it, a lot of science in it. It's quite dry in many cases. So it's not as though I've gone through massive numbers of case studies or lots of abnormal psychology or those kind of things. So the character writing, which is probably what people think of as coming from psychology, not so much, but definitely the way political systems and groups behave and fail is very much my thing.
Yeah, it's surprising no one that you wrote a dissertation about failure is your...
I had no problems believing that.
That makes total sense, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, spoiler warning, you know, there is a book where there's a big quest, and the big quest obviously fails. And a lot of people find that quite weird. They don't quite get what I was driving at there, but some people do find it highly amusing. So I suppose it all just depends on your experience and your it's possibly a matter of life experience as well. I think maybe younger people who haven't been in the workplace a lot themselves find that weird and don't kind of appreciate that most things go wrong at some time or another in some way or another. So
yeah, it took me some time to digest that one, but yeah, I've come to love it. And Lena, can we get into spoilers, Dylan? What do you think?
Yes,
we're like 30 minutes in. If you
right.
haven't read Age of Madness, go read it, guys. Buy all the books. You can't go wrong. And yeah, we're just gonna get into spoilers for every First Law World book now that's been published. So yeah, we're in it now, guys.
Free reign.
Free reign.
Barred. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things we're most interested in, Joe, is your perspective on Logan Nine Fingers as a person.
Right.
And yes, and we want a realistic take here, Joe. So
Yeah. Of
we've
course.
got this quote we pulled from Black Dow here toward the end. This is in the last chapter, appropriately titled "The Beginning" of the Last Argument of Kings. Black Dow says to Logan, "All right, but you love to play the good man, don't you? Do you know what's worse than a villain? A villain who thinks he's a hero. A man like that, there's nothing he won't do, and he'll always find himself an excuse." How accurate do you perceive Black Dow's perspective on Logan here as being?
Well, I think from his perspective, it's entirely fair, right? But then part of the point of this is, I mean, there's a quote from Shivers earlier on when he's talking to Logan, who obviously he also regards Logan as a villain earlier on, but then Logan saves his life in a battle, and he says something along the lines of, good men and evil men, it's all a matter of where you stand, So that was kind of what I was trying to get at. And it's true from Black Dow's perspective, Logan's a monster. He's destructive. He destroys everything he touches. He's addicted to violence. Whenever he appears, things go down the toilet immediately. But then, Logan asks Jezal, am I an evil man? And he says, you're the best man I know. And from his perspective, that's also true, right? So I suppose it's also about, we can make change and we can be different if we make the effort and we change ourselves and we change our surroundings, right? It's easy to be a different person when you go to a different place. Like when people go off to university, they can reinvent themselves and they often find a version of themselves they're happier with. But when they go back home, it's very hard to avoid being the person you were before. So I think that's true of Logan as well. He chooses to go back to where he was, and so he can't help becoming what he was. And in a way, he comes back full circle again later to face that same truth about himself, that, wherever you go, there you are. There's that going on as well. So I think it is fair because, Logan is, in some ways, the villain of the story, right? He's kind of responsible for what's happened in the North. If it wasn't for him, Bethod might have succeeded in forging a kind of peaceful, advanced, more cultural society, maybe, depending on who you ask. Bethod certainly thought so. So he sort of is that unpredictable element that always destroys everything. People try and harness it and make use of it, and they can for a while, but it'll always blow up in your face eventually. So I think it's fair. He is a villain, right? In a way, but he's also kind of great.
He is great.
Corner. If you're Jezal, he's like a fantastic guy to look up to. He's earned your trust and respect.
Right. It's in the eye of the beholder, I guess, and I think that so that's something we've said about Jezal typically is you can take the kid out of the Agrion, but you can't take the Agrion out of the kid. And it is that when Jezal is out with, we call them the Fellowship of the Seed, heading out in a totally distant land away from everything he's known, he can grow, he can change, he can learn from someone like Logan, who's also putting on his best face. And then, like you said, you go back and you're surrounded by the same people in the same place, and suddenly the same behaviors start popping up for you.
Yeah, exactly. That was always the idea.
And it's great reading The Age of Madness too. You get a sense of a character. It speaks to their characterization so quickly, depending on their opinion of Logan Nine Fingers. Like when both Stour and Leo are like, we'll be legends like the Bloody Nine. Like that's all they have to say. And you have an idea of what they're like as people. You're like, oh, okay. Like they have a lot to learn still.
It's true. Yeah, looking up to Logan does generally is a quick way to identify someone as a bit of a douche. I think it's better.
Yes. And it's like almost every time that comes up, if there's anyone from the older generation with any wisdom around, they'll tell them something like, you just named a bunch of dead men. And it always seems to go over their heads.
Yeah, the older generation kind of rolls their eyes sometimes. Clover will say something scathing.
Yeah. Maybe I'm a bit predictable in that line. I should have some more people who are kind of cleverly interested and excited by Logan. Maybe that's something to do in the future.
Yeah, that's speaking of the future. You've boldly brought the world of the First Law into a new age. Are there any plans to bring it even further? Is there some point in time we're going to have like a sci-fi book in the world of the First Law?
First Law in Space.
First Law in Space.
I don't know. I mean, never say never. I don't really think too far ahead generally. I mean, I've no idea what the next book in the First Law world will be. I've got a few ideas, but I think I've always wanted to move the world forward. You know, I'm sometimes frustrated by fantasy worlds that feel like they just have been in thousands of years of stasis, you know, and are never moving or developing. I like a world that feels like there's all kinds of forces of economics and progress and technology and culture kind of boiling away beneath the surface that produce, you know, a lot of the conflict within the world, that even the most powerful and important characters are kind of at the mercy of these bigger social forces of change that are always, you know, boiling away. And so the Industrial Revolution really felt like the obvious place to go after the kind of mercantile and financial revolution that was going on in the First Law a little bit, I suppose. And, you know, that's clearly a big one, and it clearly changes society a huge amount. Whether you'd want to go any further, it's tough. I think there just seems to be something about guns that feels like a Rubicon, you know, it feels like a watershed. It's hard to go back from guns. I don't know why that would be, but a lot of fantasy readers seem to feel like that's the moment they turn off, or the moment things change for them somehow. It's sort of, there's something about the face-off of hand-to-hand weapons, looking someone in the eye, that appeals, or that is noticeably different to guns. I don't know why it should be. There's no reason why it should be, really. So that's one step I feel kind of slightly reluctant to take, or that I'd want to think carefully about taking. But I think also there's probably some mileage in... Magic's been leaving the world for a long time. I think there's probably some mileage in the return of Magic, you know, and the return of Magic also to a much more advanced world is kind of potentially fascinating. I don't think that's something I've seen a huge amount of. The Magic kind of drying up is common to so many fantasies. So have it burst back through the sluice gates, I think might be quite exciting.
That's interesting. Did you have any, like you say you have concerns progressing the world even further, and I agree that's a tough thing to think about, but did you have any concerns, or did like your editors or your publishers have any concerns of moving this far into the future? Like, I'm sure people would have loved for you to write Glokta and Logan, the sequel, where you're just in the world of the First Law with those characters all the time. But to be like, no, we're in a world where they're super old actually and irrelevant, and now that world is gone, and there's like, you know, factories and things. Like, did you have any concerns advancing the world so irrevocably like that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think you're always concerned with every book, you're right, that it won't work for one reason or another. You know, if you wrote your 17th Logan Nine Fingers book, you know, maybe you'd be concerned it wouldn't do as well as the 16th. You know, after a certain point in time, people get bored. You know? So you're always trying to balance the familiar, what people liked last time, with, you know, something new that will keep them excited, because people always say they wanted, you know, the same as the last album. But they don't actually. They want something
until they get it
new in some way they can't really describe, right? I mean, they're never going to tell you, I don't want that thing I liked before. I want something else, but I can't tell you what it is. But that's basically what they do want. So, you know, you've got to always be trying, I think, to move things forward. Apart from anything else, you know, you spend years on a series of books like this. And although readers might spend weeks with it and want more, you're probably sick of it by that point. You've not got anything new to say. So you've got to keep sort of pushing yourself and challenging yourself and keeping yourself to some degree excited and uncomfortable. because that's where you produce stuff that's worth reading, I think, on the whole. So, you know, I think you're always worried about moving things on or changing things or new sets of characters or development in the world, but you kind of know instinctively it's better than the alternative of sort of stasis, where you become a kind of boring pastiche of yourself, perhaps, or there's a risk of that anyway. So I suppose I was worried a bit that people might not like it, but I felt like it was its own thing enough. You know, there's obviously steampunk and things out there that, you know, tackle some similar trappings, but that always feels a bit of a aesthetic thing. It's just, you know, sticking valves on stuff. It's not really about the social side of the Industrial Revolution in that same way, I don't think. So it felt like it, you know, Industrial Revolution in fantasy was something I hadn't seen much of. It felt like it'd be interesting. And it felt like it naturally produced a lot of conflict and drama without much effort, you know, because you have all this stuff going on, the rich against the poor, the traditional monarchy and nobility against the kind of rise of money and innovation, you know, and conservatism against progression and growth. And so, you know, immigration against, you know, people wanting to keep things as they are. So there's naturally all these forces, rural and urban, another big one, you know, the growth of cities and the shriveling of the economy, that kind of thing. So naturally, every character, you know, has these tensions and these antagonistic relationships with other people just because of where they are within what's going on. And that felt, you know, interesting and dynamic, and there was plenty to work with there. So I never really, you know, I always worry that a book's going to be bad and won't work, won't go down well, you know. And usually they are bad to begin with, because that's what happens when you first write them, you know. You write the bad version, then you make it better. That's what the process is. So it was challenging in its way, but I think to the right amount, and hopefully it will work for readers. I mean, there'll always be people who liked other books more, you know, because if you do different things, then some will work for people, some won't. You know, some people really love Red Country, some people don't like Red Country, but they like Best Served Cold, you know. And I kind of like the fact that, you know, some readers have very different opinions about what my best book is, about what, you know, my most effective character is. And I think that shows that, you know, I've tried to do some different things each time, which is probably the best you can hope for.
Yeah. Well, we've always appreciated your willingness to try on new genre. I guess, you know, you're always writing in fantasy, but you'll go Western, you'll go thriller with Best Served Cold, or more typical military fantasy with the heroes, and give it your own Joe Abercrombie twist to the tropes of that. And I'll say it, like, Red Country is my favorite of the standalones, and I loved seeing you work with that Western setting and those tropes. It was a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that, and actually, it was quite a hard book to write at the time, but I love Westerns, and I kind of love that whole feel. And there's a lot of kind of Western-y stuff in the first law, even, you know. I mean, Logan's quite a Western style of character, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, fit that well.
And so, yeah, Red Country was a lot of fun, but not everyone. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Westerns is it's a very, it's a strong spice. You know, it's kind of very obviously Western. You know, it's windswept streets and it's cattle drives and it's very Westerny in a way that the heroes, you know, the heroes is sort of every war. It doesn't feel like one thing or another. It's quite easy to do that. So Red Country, if you don't like Westerns, it's gonna be kind of unpleasant for you. There's no doubt.
Strong spice. I like that.
I mean, there were chaps.
Should we? And of course, and the 10-gallon hats and all that. The spurs. Dylan, I think it's time we enter into some of these more hard-hitting questions about some of these characters that we were talking about earlier. What do you think?
All right. Yeah. Yes. All right. Why does Glocta do this?
Well, if your impression is that that's a routine question he's asking, which will at some point be answered with a sort of straight up thing. Well, Wednesday mornings he has yoga, so Thursday is the only time he can do this. You know, if it's going to be a technical answer of that kind, I think you're probably barking up the wrong tree there. Yeah, I mean, why he does it is the eternal open question of his of his life, right?
Yeah.
So he asks it to himself one more time, I believe, in this final book. I'm not spoiling anything there.
Ooh, great
And
tease.
that's a kind of
nice tease.
It's a key moment, because he don't think he's actually said it elsewhere in the series, but of course readers will know that he's endlessly asking himself that question. So someone else asks him, and he has a wry laugh to himself, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I think you find that quite humorous.
Yeah. It's definitely the musing of it and the asking of it is much more interesting than is the answering of it. And I'm sure it's just so many complicated factors for Glokta that he's always trying to mull over. And it's we're we're only expecting more musings from the author who gave us Glokta's internal
we're not
monologue.
expecting definitive epic grand reveals here, I don't think, when it comes to Glokta's musings.
Yes.
Well, I suppose, he's a guy who's been massively damaged, right? He was sort of an exploration of consequences, talking earlier about heroes who don't suffer these massive consequences really in fantasy, and they can be very violent and have violent things done to them but basically come away fine. He's a guy who has not come away fine, and he sort of finds himself outside of society, and the only way he can make a contribution is through doing what was done to him, in effect, because he's become very good and has a very good insight into it.
Right.
But he sort of refuses to be useless, right? He refuses to just sit back. He insists on being effective. And I guess that's he says at one point to Beaz something like, I'm happy to die, but I refuse to lose.
Yes.
So he wants to still win. And I suppose if there's a reason why he does this, really, that is it. He's a little bit like Beaz in many ways, in a world that has kind of lost a lot of meaning to him. Winning is one of the few things that has still got meaning.
And that's super interesting thinking too about Savine, who, when we first meet her, I think the chapter is called Keeping Score. And she's pretty much talking about at the end of it how she doesn't even care about money. She's always had lots of that. It's just how else are you going to keep score? So you get to see how that Glokta influence gets passed down, and even if it's not hereditary, it was maybe taught.
Nature over nurture.
Nurture over nature.
Astute observation. That is a very Glokta thing to say, right? And it gets to the heart of what she's about quite effectively as well, that she's interested in being on top, in beating the competition. She's not really, as you say, she's not interested in making money or winning, except to, prove her superiority over other people.
Right.
Really.
And she has no reason to keep making investments and belittling others. She just continues to do it because she likes to win, like Glokta, like Beaz. What else would there be?
So nothing left. This is some people kind of talk about, will Beaz beat Khalil, but I don't think Beaz wants to beat Khalil, because if he did, who'd be the audience?
Yeah.
To acknowledge his genius. He's the one person who can acknowledge that Beaz is the best, right? That's what he wants.
Yes, it's almost that Polder and Croy situation where it's in the rivalry more than the actual winning of the thing. And
they never realized they were pushing against each other so hard that if one of them was removed, the other would just fall flat on his face.
Exactly right.
Well said. Yeah. And I do think that's something it seems Beaz appreciates about Glokta. Like you said, there are some similarities there, and he gives him that breakdown of everything he's done. It seems like just for he's got Phil Glokta in, but he's reveling in it. And
he wants to be acknowledged.
Yeah, it's
someone worthy.
He just wants to be seen.
He's like, here's one of the few people that will actually understand when I start bragging. This is good.
Yeah, exactly. Most of these ants won't even understand the level of my glorious triumph, but I feel in you.
I love watching Beaz revel in bragging. It's so good.
Yeah. that moment where he's just yelling, he's like, "I'm greater than Eos himself." We always quote that. It's just Baez, the beauty of his bounce of great power and just absolute pettiness is.
Yeah. His vast pettiness is definitely an important part of that. Yeah. The banana is just kind of petty middle management, really, more than anything. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
We've always wondered like what a POV from Baez would look like. Have you ever considered like a Sharp End style story from Baez's perspective, or is that just too hard to write, or you don't want to go behind the curtain too much on Baez?
Yeah.
Funny enough, he was a point of view in my very first kind of abortive take.
Oh, wow.
The story. But it very obviously doesn't really work very well.
Huh.
I mean, because it means you have to either just avoid the elephant in the room and, you know, trick the reader by not telling them what's going on in a way that is entirely unconvincing. You know, sometimes you can get away with not sharing everything that's happening with the reader, you know. So in The Trouble with Peace, since we're in the spoiler bit, you know, Rika pulls a fast one, and you're in her head, but she doesn't explain to the reader what she's thinking, right? Which is kind of, sort of slightly cheating, maybe, but it's fine. It's not a big one, and it soon pays off. But, you know, you couldn't sit in Baez's head at the start of The Blade itself without understanding what was going on and what he's up to, you know? So it's the wrong place to be as well. You know, I wanted to be with the little people, the little ants on the board who don't understand what's happening. Because that's how you can trick the reader in a way. So I don't think he's in Baez's head is the right place to be. It would sort of demystify what's better mystical. I mean, I feel the same way often about magic, you know. And again, being in Baez's head, he'd be thinking in magical terms sometimes, and then you'd have to kind of explain it in a way or make it literal. And you make literal and obvious and concrete what is much better guessed at, hinted at, you know. So I think I would probably stay out of Baez's head.
Yeah, if you had to write a short story, it would just have to be something so petty that had no implication to the story at all. But I see what you're saying. He is, even though he's barely represented in some of these books, he is the master puppeteer, right? So to get behind his head too much, that man behind the curtain, essentially, it would have undone all the first law too, for sure. Yeah,
no, I think so.
Even a glimpse of the puppeteer can be extremely alarming, and as Baez makes sure we all know. Yes. So you need those puppets dancing, Joe.
Yeah, watch the pretty meat puppets.
Yes.
So this question we're about to ask is one that's probably the most heavily debated, people trying to figure it out in the first law community. Is there anything supernatural going on with the Bloody Nine, or has it always been Logan?
Yeah, people ask that a lot. And I mean, I suppose I don't like too much to get into, to discuss the content in that way outside of what's there, because in a way, if it's vague and it's a bit unclear, then I feel that's because it should be, so.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I've got some explanation for you that is going to, wrap it all up.
Right.
So that there is some doubt, I think is fine. To me, it's a less interesting character if he's somehow not responsible for what he does or what he is, though, right?
It's demystifying what's better mystified, right? And that's what we love about Logan so much. Right. You can love him and also recognize the horrible war crimes he's committed, but still find him likable. It's like, yeah, he killed that little kid for no reason. He killed his best friend, but what a great character, I love his catchphrases.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of my take on Norse berserker myths a little bit, and I suppose it seemed natural there might be a sort of alternate personality that someone like that might have. So it's sort of a little bit split personality-ish, though. I mean, you, of course, will know that that's all a little bit mythologized, and whether any such real condition exists is sort of hard to say.
There's definitely contention, about that.
It certainly comes up a lot more in stories than it comes up in reality, right? So
Definitely.
I mean, it was a berserker take, and obviously he has this kind of slightly magical route as well. But to me, it's really about, he's a guy who is addicted to violence and addicted to what he is, addicted to the status it gives him, and not really happy unless he is, able to demonstrate his dark side in that way and sort of claim the respect that he gains from being feared, really. Yeah. He loves to be feared. Yeah. He likes to pretend that he's not, but he kind of does when it comes down to it. He can't avoid, playing up to that role.
For sure.
And he naturally puts himself in positions, where the bomb is going to go off.
Yeah.
Even if he can't necessarily control the bomb completely, he could take the bomb off into the desert and blow it up there where no one's going to, mind. But he doesn't. He sticks it among the people that he knows, and he can't help himself. So I suppose that's really what it's about more than anything.
Right. Yeah. It's just a part of this whole Logan being able to try to project his bad behaviors onto some other entity, and whether it's supernatural, whether it's just part of him, is less important than the grappling of that question. And yeah, it's so interesting with Logan. You can get caught in his almost like passivity with which he views the behaviors, and it's like, oh, somehow I just ended up with this sword in my hand, floating like leaf down to Carleon. It's like, it's like literally you had this point where you could have gone anywhere and you went right back to the north to settle scores. But it's easy with how tight you are to the perspective and to how he sees himself, where I think a lot of readers think of Logan as this like almost victim of circumstance more than someone who actually puts himself in the position.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do, and I did everything I could to make him as likable as possible. So I suppose that just shows that in a sense succeeded. You want the people to feel complicated and conflicted and contradictory in some ways, as people very much are, and that goes back again to Blackdow thinking of him as an absolute villain, and Jezal thinking of him as the best man he knows. In a way, he's both those things, depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, and that's what I love about your characterization, is because it's this idea of like, it's not good people doing good things and bad people, like evil people doing bad things. It's just like people that that occasionally do horrible things, and they don't necessarily have a good reason. In the Age of Madness, I think of Broad quite a bit, because he's another character who does horrible things sometimes, or violent things sometimes, but you wouldn't say he's evil or anything like that. It's again this idea of like people in circumstances, maybe they're addicted to violence, but they're not evil. They still want to do good things, and they're heroes in their own heads sometimes, more so Logan than Broad. Broad is very self-deprecating, but it's just that idea of like, it's not always good versus evil, like maybe a modern fantasy book would be. It's exploring what happens when like normal people do evil things.
Yeah, and I suppose that whole thing of good against evil was commonplace in the fantasy I was reading as a kid, and then I started reading things like James Ellroy's LA Quartet, the noir LA books, that LA Confidential is based on. Those are books that are incredibly murky and dark, and where the protagonists are very seedy and, have all kinds of demons and difficulties. And I was just kind of fascinated by the way those books work, and how these very murky characters interrelate and occasionally do heroic things and occasionally do appalling things, just as you were saying. So LA Confidential was actually a really important book for me. And in that book, funnily enough, you have effectively three kind of central male figures, who are a kind of guy with an incredibly violent, dangerous temper who can't escape his bloody nature, sort of used up outsider with this world-weary attitude to everything, and this sort of smart-ass young guy with a massively high opinion of himself who wants to climb the sort of official ladder. So there may be some inspiration that I drew. Story.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, We'll have to give LA Confidential a read just to see if we can notice some of those parallels there. And I know you've got a lot of different inspirations. I've heard you talk about things like Lonesome Dove. I've heard you talk about films. Something that I really have wanted to know for a while, Joe, is do you ever watch Quentin Tarantino movies? I feel like he's got a very a voice that you appreciate. Like you both have this ability to wink at and twist genre tropes. You have this juxtaposition of your gritty, intense violence with humor. You ever watch his movies? They resonate for you?
So? Oh, yeah. I mean, well, and Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, so his first two big films, you know, and also True Romance, which he didn't direct, but wrote. Those films were huge for me at the time. Those two particularly. I mean, particularly Pulp Fiction, which kind of really blew my mind at the time in the way it was organized and the way the kind of narrative was broken up. I mean, just so clever. And perhaps now seems kind of almost obvious because it's so sort of imitated and influential. You know, it almost seems a bit over the top, a bit pleased with itself, a bit familiar, you know, but at the time it was really quite amazing. And Reservoir Dogs, likewise, a brilliant film, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what he's done since, I've been a bit more kind of on the fence about one way or another. There's things I've liked and things that I've been a bit more kind of, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think his early stuff's brilliant. And it's that, as you say, that fusion of kind of extreme darkness and violence with, you know, funny things erupting out of nowhere, but also the kind of the conversational nature of things. It's something that Elmore Leonard, another writer that I like a lot, Justified, you know, is based on a short story of his and has very much his tone. He does this thing where, you know, every idiot in the story, every thug or, you know, guy in the background or irrelevant cop has some sort of persona, something going on.
Yeah.
Some fight he's having with his brother, some hobby he's into, you know, everyone feels like they're kind of a real person somehow.
Right.
And Tarantino, again, will do this thing of he'll just let people talk. He's not interested in shoving things along. He'll do these long, discursive, rambling kind of conversations where people are just talking about stuff. And that sort of observational quality within a genre piece, you know, where you expect things to be moving along. Yeah. I've always been quite kind of fascinated by that. And you know, that's something I kind of like to do, is just let people talk at length, which perhaps some people sometimes find a bit dull, but I just find that's where the really good stuff is. No, it's not really the sword fights at all. Or the sword fights become interesting because you're interested in the people, right? And you get interested in the people through the dialogue.
Totally agree. Yeah, that's awesome. I've been wanting to ask you that forever, since Best Served Cold. I recommend it a lot of times with a Kill Bill reference. It's got some of that kind of feel to it. And I think it's so interesting to hear that you actually are into him and you have all these thoughts and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's awesome. So cool. I know Charles has a question about a side character that he would feel like we've been remiss if he didn't ask. So
that's true. And as much as we love the books, we are obsessed with the audiobooks as well. Stephen Pacey is absolutely incredible performances across all of these books, and
no doubt, brilliant.
His just commitment to all of these different scenes and his deliveries and his lines, they're incredible. And even some of those awkward sex scenes, he gives it his all to, which you gotta respect. But you could just tell that he gets like what the story's about, and he's able to deliver narration and dialogue in a way that only someone who generally has an appreciation for the book and understanding of it could do. And to me, it's like my go-to recommendation for an audiobook for sure. And sometimes his voices, they just stick in my brain, and we talk about them on the show. And one of the ones that kind of took off, you know, there's the scene where Severard is tailing Pharaoh, And Pharaoh, I can't even believe I'm telling you this, Joe. This is and Pharaoh like has Severard like knife to the throat situation, and she's like, "Why shouldn't I kill you right now? Give me one reason." And then Stephen Pacey's just like, my birds. And Pharaoh's like brain kind of short wires, and she just lets him go. She has like a lapse of her memories of her dad with birds, and she doesn't know how to handle this moment, and just lets him go. And so we're always like, my birds. And so we were wondering, with the end of the last argument of kings, Severard's unfortunate demise, what is the canon for these birds? Did they starve in the cage, or did they somehow, like old Bill in Lord of the Rings, get to go off and fly with other birds and live happy, full lives? Can we get some headcanon that we can put in the First Law Wiki, maybe?
I couldn't. Well, we spoke earlier about how I'd rather not, pin down things.
Keep things mystified. Yeah. You don't have to now. I want to keep your artistic integrity intact.
Exactly. Well, it's not something that I've personally given that amount of thought to, but I suppose the wonderful thing about being a reader of books is that you can, invent your own possibilities. I'm sure many things readily emerge. There were some birds, weren't there, released at the at Savine and Leo's wedding, I think. They had some birds flutter away, at a key moment. And I think maybe Duke Regent had some birds going off at his coronation as well, right? He had
they might have died though, if I'm remembering.
And they went off just as everyone had died. Everyone had died on stage. Suddenly the birds were released. They went up. Yeah. But maybe some of Severard's were among one or other of those. Who knows? They could have gone on to great things, to stardom in a way.
I see. You're keeping your chess pieces close to the vest. I see. Okay.
Well, I might want to, write a short story about those birds at some point. Who knows?
I can respect that. Okay.
Right.
Okay. We don't need, like you said, some things are better left mystified. Maybe someday you'll do another short story collection, and we'll find out a little bit more, maybe. But we won't ask you to play those pieces so definitively on the show.
No. Well, I've got a short story coming out next year, funnily enough. So these each of these books, I did a kind of edition for Waterstones in the bookstore in the UK, which has a short story in it. So there's 3 short stories, one for each book. They kind of do a typical clever ass thing. Like the first one's called The Thread, and it starts on the cotton fields, and it starts with a ex-slave on a cotton field, then it goes to a cotton merchant in Dagoska, then it goes to a guy who spins the thread in a factory, and it ends up in Savine's dress. That's kind of the story. And there's another one with a diamond in Orso's crown, and there's one with a knife that someone's killed with. It starts off in the or in the ground and so on. So the idea was to do some industrial processes that show you something about the world. So those 3 are going to be packaged up into a novella, but along with a 4th one that I've done as well, which is kind of about the Great Change generally. And so Subterranean Press are going to do that.
That'd be very interesting. Maybe just floating the idea as a 5th one. Someone hasn't been paying their rent, so they go to a victim, open the door, it's a cage full of birds in here.
Yeah.
What should we do? Yeah.
Just give me 1 second.
Yeah. Sorry. Joe is now going to write down in his notes.
Yeah.
We are getting Severard's birds.
Maybe you could co-author this. I saw you were very disconcerted.
Sorry, guys.
Oh,
someone just came for one of my son's friends to take him away.
Oh, I see. Well, it has been a while already. We don't want to keep you too much longer. Dylan, is there anything we need to ask Joe Abercrombie, author of The World of the First Law, while he's here on the show?
I think we just have to say thank you. Thank you so much, Joe.
Oh, hey,
this has been
sorry to cut it short in that slightly bizarre manner.
No. We're over the hour.
We thought you were off writing that 5th book. Just I had to get these notes down quick while the inspiration struck. Just making sure you got some ideas down before you forgot.
Yeah, it is important. When an idea comes, you got to grab that.
Exactly.
I had about 6 together. The 7th one appeared, then I'd want to catch that quickly.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, Joe, this is quite an honor for us. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I couldn't think of a better way to end this World of First Law read along that we've had on the show than having you here. So, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, look, it's been a pleasure, guys, and thanks for engaging with the book so sort of deeply and profoundly, and taking them so seriously. I really appreciate it. It's lovely that people are out there doing that, and I will tweet this out to everyone I can, and hopefully people will watch and enjoy it.
Nice. Awesome. Something to be said about using Twitter, which is icon as a bird.
He's still caught on the birds, Joe.
There's some deep capital L literature metaphor in there.
It's the one of Severid's birds that got away, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Well, Joe Abercrombie, thank you so much for coming on the show. Wisdom of Crowds drops tomorrow. Get in line now for the big release. Looking forward to the audiobook as well. I'm assuming Pacey will return for the audiobook. Same day. Wow. So I'm super excited about that. So guys, go check them out.
Yeah, do so. And I hope you enjoy the final book, but if you don't, just don't call me again.
Praise only for Joe, guys, please. And maybe you had a bad copy, so you can get another one and see maybe if the ending's a little different for you. So, okay, well, everyone, thank you so much for listening. And as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends.